Hello everyone, so today we'll be talking about the ringing issue and the driver tension on all commercially available planar magnetic headphones. Now, if you do remember the history of planar magnetic headphones, they were introduced back in 2010 or somewhere around 2011. I forget which company released their first model. If it's the Odyssey or the Hi-Fi Man. If I do recall right, Odyssey released their pre-phaser LCD2 in mid or late 2010, while Hi-Fi Man released their first model at the same time. I couldn't recall exactly which time Hi-Fi Man released their model, so I'm not sure. But the development of the two headphone company has like went through a lot of trouble, and now their flagship offering is several steps above what we could get like 5 or 6 years ago. When 5 years ago the LCD2 is widely regarded as the planar magnetic king because it has extremely low distortion and very linear bass, which extends all the way down to 10 hertz. Now, when planar magnetic headphones were first introduced, they were touted to combine they were touted as the best of both worlds. They got the efficiency of a dynamic headphone, but they do combine the low THD, the low distortion nature of electrostatic headphone, and compared to a typical stats, they have better low end extension and weight. But compared to a dynamic headphone, it also has a more correct mid range, and everything just sounds, you know, just sounds more correct, because usually for dynamic headphones, housing tuning affects the sound a lot, but in planar magnetics you usually hear each frequency like much more, for lack of a better word, correct. And that is what people has been, what manufacturers has been telling people since the beginning of 2010. Now fast forward 8 years, it's 2018, and a lot has been changing about planar magnetics. And one thing people found out is that some people do not think planar magnetics sound more natural than either dynamic or electrostatic headphones, and what they found is the total opposite. Some people, including me, found out that most planar magnetic headphones tend to exhibit this weird behavior called planar compression, which is to say, on loud and dynamic passages, it does not sound as dynamically alive as a dynamic headphone, while on quiet passages, it's not as quiet as a dynamic headphone, and that is a problem in itself. Well, this problem is very evident on Hi-Fi Man's later offerings, like their HE400i, their HE400S, the Sundara, and the original HE400. Now, Audi's LCD doesn't really exhibit this problem until they release the phase model, or the phaser model, which is the LCD2 and LCD3 phaser. Now, the phaser itself is not a problem, since they are released to correct the frequency overlap of the different segments of the driver, so that the frequencies do not overlap and form a distorted wavefront, which is to say, the phaser itself is not the issue, but the issue is the driver tension. Actually, there is a thread on SBAF regarding driver tension, and it's right here. And the argument begins with LCD3 as an example. As Purin here has stated, not all LCD3s are born the same. Now, there are veiled LCD3s and there are good LCD3s. Personally, for me, I haven't heard of a LCD3, but at one point I had two LCD2s, one pre-phaser and one post-phaser. Now, what I found is that the LCD2 with phaser is a lot more easier to drive, thanks to whatever they did to the headphone. But what I found is that the post-phaser LCD2 is actually more congested sounding than the pre-phaser LCD2, With pre-phaser LCD2, I can hear more macro dynamics. So when the music is loud, it is loud, but when it's quiet. Like everything sounds like they're supposed to sound. While the post-phaser LCD2, I cannot hear much of a dynamic difference, which is to say, when the music is supposed to get quiet, it does not quiet down that much, and when the music gets loud, when everything is, blooming, sparkling, it just does not sparkle or bloom as much as a dynamic headphone. And that is what bugs me, and for the longest time I have no idea what this is until I stumble across the thread on SPAF. Now Purin has addressed this issue, and for most planar magnetics in the measurements, you can see a wall-like wave in certain frequencies. Well, it varies for different designs and different drivers for different enclosures, but it's a common sight seen in planar magnetic headphones because it depends on the driver tension. Now that we mentioned driver tension, I want to explain what it is and how much it affects sound. Now, as you can all see, a planar magnetic driver is like this. This is an explosion view of an Audi's planar magnetic driver. Now, as you can see here, these two are permanent magnets, and this thing is the membrane, or as people call it, the driver, which actually makes sound. Now, the driver itself is composed of two permanent magnets. Depends on whether it's double-sided or single-sided. If it's single-sided, then it only has one permanent magnet. If it's double-sided, then it has two. Let's take LCD2 for example. It has two magnets, a membrane, and this thing they call it the enclosure, which holds everything in place. Now, as we can see here, the membrane is what actually makes sound because it vibrates and it pushes air back and forth, and this is what actually makes sound. As you can see here, because planar magnetics get magnetic force across the whole driver, unlike dynamic headphones, which only get the driver only get pushed inwards and outwards on certain points. So the magnetic force is more evenly distributed on a planar magnetic membrane, so it gets more even force across the whole driver, so it's touted to have more natural frequency response because the driver gets more magnetic exposure. But since then, people have found out that it isn't necessarily true, because the huge issue for planar magnetic drivers is that the edge is hung on the surround, on the enclosure, which means it does not have much excursion, if there's any at all. Now, one thing the dynamic headphone drivers does way better than a planar magnetic driver is that it actually has a reasonable travel. Now, what we're looking here is a AudioQuest Nighthawk driver, and when it first came out in 2015, or is it 2016? I couldn't quite remember. When it first came out, I was so surprised, and I went to buy one. I usually don't do impulse purchase, but the reason I got one is because the technology inside these is so revolutionary, and they introduced a surround to the driver, which is what I've been dreaming about for the past like 8 or 9 years. This is the first time they actually implemented a surround on a headphone driver, and I can't be more excited to actually try it. And try as I might, it actually does make a big difference. Now, as everyone can see, the Nighthawks have a very low distortion graph. The THD on this headphone is absolutely insane. If I do recall right, even at 50 Hz, the THD hasn't risen above 2%, which is pretty insane because on most other dynamic headphones, the lower the frequency is, the more distortion you get, and typically on an HD 650, you will get somewhere around 4 to 5% distortion on 80 hertz, not to mention 30 hertz. On 30 hertz, you'll probably get 10%, total harmonic distortion, which is crazy high. But anyways, on traditional dynamic drivers, we do not have a surround because the way a headphone works is pretty different from a speaker in that headphones require direct coupling, which is to say your ear is directly coupled to the headphone drivers, and that is why they have ear pads. Now, the reason why they need to have ear pads is because your ears have to seal, they need to create a seal between your ear and the driver, so all the wavefronts created by the drivers can successfully get to your ear. Now, that is not how a speaker works, because a speaker doesn't, while a speaker does have enclosure, it isn't directly coupled to your ears, because there is nothing that sits between the driver and your ear that directly guides the wavefront to your ear. So the drivers need to be bigger, have more excursion. They need to push a lot more air than a headphone driver can, so they can compensate for the loss of bass. Well, a headphone driver does not have to do that because while the driver is pretty small, you do get an enclosure and a coupling device, which is the ear pads, which couples the driver directly with your ear, so the air can't escape the air can't escape the driver before it reaches your ears, so your ear gets all the information put out from the driver. Now, why is this an issue? Well, on traditional headphone drivers, you can see it implements an edgeless design, which is to say the major difference between a headphone driver and a speaker driver is that it does not have surround, because the driver does not have to travel a long distance, because it does not have to compress as much air. So which is to say it does not have to have much travel. Now, what the Nighthawk driver did is they put a surround on the driver to let it have more travel, and as a result can move way more air when it comes to bass frequencies below 120 or 200 hertz. And this is very evident on Nighthawk's CSD water plot and THD plot, as well as their frequency response plot. They are very, very impressive in those regards. As you can see, the lower frequency extends much like a planar magnetic would, because they are pretty much free of peaks or dips and extends all the way to 10 hertz with no problem, and that is extremely impressive for a dynamic driver, because most dynamic drivers have a mid-bass hump that makes their bass sound boomy, but they do not necessarily have the ultimate bass extensions. You can see here, this is a measurement of the Sennheiser HD600s. The frequency below 100 Hz drop off so significantly at 10 Hz, it has a 15 decibel dip. Now, what this means is that for traditional dynamic drivers, they cannot produce the lowest bass, while on the Nighthawks it can. But on planar magnetics, they also reach the lowest octave, but the problem is exactly what I mentioned above. Much like a traditional dynamic driver, these things do not have a surround, and as a result, all the edges need to be hung on the enclosure, and what that means is the driver needs to be tensioned. Like, you need to stretch the thin film. You need to actually stretch it and make it very what's the word? And make it very rigid, as opposed to soft or elastic, because you want lower distortion in treble region, or like frequencies above 10K. So it needs to apply some tension. But what tension would do to the driver is that it would lose excursion, because imagine this: if you tension the driver really tight, then it can't move back and forth, for a long distance before it has to stop. But if you don't tension the driver too tight, then the control over the driver isn't as strong as you would tension it tight, and as a result, the high frequency response won't be as good. So what this means for a planar magnetic driver is that each planar magnetic driver has an optimal tension. If you tension it too tight, then you wouldn't necessarily get the lowest bass response. It would drop off below 100 hertz. But if you tension it too loose, then high frequencies would sound wonky, and it wouldn't extend as high. And that is a problem most planar magnetic drivers need to overcome. Now, what this means for planar compression is that no matter what the optimal point is, you're gonna tension it. And there's no driver tension on a dynamic headphone because it doesn't need to be tensioned. It can travel, it can travel freely before it reaches X max, but on a planar magnetic headphone, a tension is always applied to the thin film right here. So you would hear some planar compression, as people call it, and it won't be as dynamically alive as some dynamic headphone offerings. Now, as you can see here, different planar headphones have different ringing issues because the ringing is caused by the driver tension. Here is a CSD waterfall plot of the LCD3. As we can see, no, it's for the monoprice M1060. As we can see here, M1060 suffers tremendously from the ringing in 5K. Now, usually, planar magnetic headphones have pretty notorious ortho walls, but usually it's inaudible and users should not hear it. But in M1060's case, the ringing issue is so severe that it not only reflects on the graph, but also you can actually hear it because the 5K region is just unbearably loud. Like, it got this whistling sound that a lot of users find annoying. Otherwise, it would be a fantastic headphone, but the ringing just ruined it all. Now, here is the CSD graph of, I believe, an early production Audi's LCD2. The ringing is definitely there, but on the graph is not apparent at all because, as you can see here, the ringing is not nearly as severe as the M1060. So, in an actual listening test, the listener is not gonna tell which frequency is ringing, nor can he actually hear it. Now, here is a graph of the CSD waterfall plot of an LCD3, and here is a waterfall plot of the LCD2, a different LCD3. As you can see here, because the drivers are tensioned differently, they have slightly different frequencies for the ortho wall. For this one, it's below 5K, and for this one, it's even lower. But regardless, it reflects on the driver tension of the headphone. Now, if you ask me if I actually hear it on the headphone, I would say I definitely can hear it compared to traditional dynamic offerings like the Sennheiser HD600s, the 650, and the HD580. I personally find the Hi-Fi Match E6 more, it has more hard-hitting bass, but for orchestral music, I would still grab my HD600s because they just sound more dynamic, and it is not something planar magnetic headphones can completely get rid of, unfortunately, because as long as it's of a planar design, it is gonna have some tension on the driver, and as long as it has some tension on the driver, it would have ortho wall. Whether or not it's audible, it would ultimately affect its X max and travel. As we explained earlier, the lower the tension, the more the driver can travel, but the wonkier the travel will get, and the tighter the tension, the more in control the travel will be, but the less excursion the driver would have, which will result in a drop off in the lowest octave. Now, for the Hi-Fi Match E6, I would definitely say this issue is persistent despite it being an excellent all-arounder headphone. It is something you should consider before buying it, since it's definitely not cheap. And at $900, you're also looking at the Focal Clear on secondhand market. You can usually obtain it for around $850, and it is competing hand to hand with the Hi-Fi Match E6. If you like deeper bass or say a more weighty sound, then you should go for the Hi-Fi Match E6. But like I just said, if you do not want that planar compression. And first of all, you need to know what a planar compression is, and if you don't like it, then I would suggest you grab the full cal clear. I've had the clear 2 months before and have since sold it, but I find it an excellent value at $850. I might still try it, sometimes maybe next year, or I don't know, probably after I sell some of these headphones, but yeah, it definitely deserves a second chance. And yeah, so here is an explanation for planar magnetic driver tension. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.